inhabit space, it suggests that whatever we do, or thought, or speech and action are meaningful. So another way to understand that is to say that architecture is like a theater. If you imagine a theater, this is the famous Palladian theater in Vicenza, in Italy. But the characteristic of a theater is that when you get on the stage, even if the theater is empty, it suggests that what you say has a meaning, has a relevance. So one of the most powerful things that architecture does is actually to be conducing to the idea that what we do has a relevance, what we do has a meaning. So architecture does not only do that, but architecture provides, if you like, a frame in which human action acquires a meaning. The Renaissance theorist, Daniele Barbaro, was, by the way, one of Andreas Palladio's protectors, famously declared that architecture enabled humans to create a world for themselves, which was neither pure nature nor the transcendental world of the gods, but actually a measured world for humans. So now, returning to Heidegger and its vehement anti-modern stance, the philosopher was probably right in his diagnostic of a crisis of dwelling linked to modernist technology, to the car, to mechanization, etc. But he tended to forget that part of the modernist ambition, part of the ambition of modern architects and urbanists, was actually to restore a human measure, to restore a world, a meaningful world for humans through a process comparable to redemption. So let me try to explain a little bit what I mean by that. Of course, technology had destabilized the way humans inhabited. Things were going too fast. Things were so fast that people got disoriented, etc. What did it mean? People felt uprooted from their traditional settings. But actually, the modernist architect and urbanist believed that technology could also enable to redeem to save inhabiting dwelling, to make it again something scalable and measurable. This is very clear with Le Corbusier. One of the functions of architecture for him is to actually recreate an harmony between the possibility to go very fast using cars, for example, and the traditional measure of man, and her contact to nature. If you take the Villa Savoye, revealingly, you arrive there very fast by modern car. On the left, you can see what was a modern car from Le Corbusier. And then you took a ramp in which you began to walk up the villa, and then you reach the top of the villa, and there you regain the consciousness of the human traditional rhythm, the connection to nature, that you could see through the framed window that you see on the right, etc. So this idea that a reconciliation between the rhythm of mechanization and the immemorial rhythm of human walk. The reason I'm mentioning that is because a lot of critique of digital technology have argued that digital technology has profoundly disturbed our traditional rhythm of living, which happens to be, to a large extent, true. It has disturbed the way we live every day. It has disturbed our schedule. We tend to look all the time at our screens, etc., etc. So we are far from the kind of serenity that is usually associated with the idea of dwelling. So, and this is, of course, linked also to globalization. How can we truly inhabit? How can we truly dwell in a world that goes so fast, that has erased every traditional boundary? So this is among the common critique of the digital. What I will try to argue at this stage is that actually there is probably through the digital, just like the modern tried to see a possible reconciliation between the automobile and more generally mechanization and the capacity of architecture to make spaces inhabitable, dwellable again, there is the same concern. I think for me, one of the major concerns of digital architecture should be, and is actually very often, how to truly inhabit in a digital world. Even I think Patrick Schumacher's parametricism may be interpreted from this perspective, despite its focus on the stylistic dimension and its notorious link with unbridled star architecture hubris. How will we live? To paraphrase the title of the last Biennale, the previous Biennale, not this one, but the previous one, how will we live together? How will we live is one of the big questions today. Is the digital, in other words, synonymous or contemporary with a new age of dwelling? How are we going to inhabit space? How are we going to define or redefine who we are? This might be probably the most essential question, more essential perhaps than just the technology, because it's about the purpose of the technology, the why. It's not how. Technology tells you how to do things, but the why remains probably the most fundamental question for a designer. What is the purpose of design? Why do we design spaces, houses, cities, etc.? So again, is the digital synonymous with a new age of dwelling? I think that such a question must be addressed at three distinct levels. And this is what I'm going to try to do with you in a moment. The first is about what are the changes that digital technology brings to the concrete experience of the built environment. I think the pandemic has contributed to reveal some of these changes, but the full picture is still far from clear. In other words, how do we experience the built environment today through the filter of digital technology? Second question, I insisted a lot at the beginning of this lecture on the fact that inhabiting, dwelling, is both about what is out there, the space, the building, the materials, the light, but also who are we who are experiencing that. So the second question is how these changes in the concrete experience of the built environment are related to a different understanding of the human, a different understanding that is often presented as a transition toward a post-human condition. Are we really becoming post-human? Or is it actually, are we still very much humans? Thirdly, probably the least evident to address, because we're just at the beginning of an evolution. In some ways, the technology has gone very fast, but actually its impact, it's still hard to assess in concrete terms. Will these shifts lead to the emergence of new spatial organization and programs? In particular, how could housing be impacted beyond the multiplication of screens in all sorts of rooms, from kitchen to bedrooms, and from family rooms to home offices? It's very striking that we do have new tools. We have, of course, computer software, we have digital fabrication, AI is on the rise, etc. But we haven't yet completely seen what are the concrete consequences on housing. We still live in relatively traditional apartments and houses. What is changing? Where could the evolution lead spaces of inhabitation is, for me, one of the big questions in the near future. Just like, if you think of electricity, or before that, more generally mechanization, how did it change houses? Retrospectively, we know how things changed. We don't know yet for the digital. So really, these are the three questions. What are the changes of the experience of the built environment? How are these changes related to a different understanding of who we are as humans, or possibly post-humans? And third, what are some of the concrete evolution that we might be observing, that we may have started to observe? So these are the three things I'd like to discuss with you today. So let me start by the changing experience of the material world and the home. The first thing I'd like to insist is that the digital has not taken architecture away from the physical world, to the contrary. It's very striking. You have a lot of critics of the digital have suggested that the digital was making us more estranged, more distant from the physical world, etc., that the increase in electronic stimuli and the time spent offline was actually detrimental to a perception of material phenomena. I would actually argue that this is not what has happened in reality. We haven't seen a dematerialization of a world. We have seen rather a different sort of materiality. And this is why actually I wrote the book on the materiality of architecture with the central hypothesis that actually the digital was creating a different a different experience of materiality. So, of course, since the beginning of the digital age, something like 25 to 30 years ago, the use of computer, tablets, and above all, cell phones has contributed to change the way we hear, we even touch what surrounds us. It's very striking. I'll take vision, for example. In an age of digital images, etc., we don't see in the way, the contrary of the rise of photography at the end of the 19th century, we're perceiving the world. By the same token, in the age of digital music, our perception of sound has changes, but also our perception of smell is beginning to change with all the computer design, perfume, etc., that we're beginning to see, or perception of touch, with a kind of heightened perception of textures that is very characteristic of what's happening today. And to evoke a subject on which I worked also, the so-called return of ornament, one of the very striking aspects of this return is the kind of blurring between the sense of touch and vision that has happened. This is very conspicuous in projects such as Herzog and de Meuron's The Young Museum in San Francisco. But more generally, our contemporary architectural ornament, most of the time designed with the use of computer, is very often based on a kind of synesthesis of blurring of the sense of vision and the sense of touch. But more generally, we see today a kind of blurring of the sharp division between atoms of matter and bits of information, which is probably the most important evolution, something that MIT professor Gershenfeld advocated when he introduced the idea of digital materials, and also later Gramazio and Kohler in Zurich speaking of a digital materiality, and Achim Menges and his interest in digital fabrication and a kind of material computation is also very much part of this evolution. It has led, as we all know, to a very different way to occupy space, to practice cities, in which atoms and bits of information are constantly interacting one with another. And we live in a kind of augmented reality, and this augmentation is among the key dimensions that has enabled the rise of the so-called smart city. A smart city is a city in which atoms and bits of information are increasingly hybridized. Now, if we turn to architecture, this set of evolution that once again can be characterized as a change in the materiality, that is, in the experience of materiality, has led to a number of evolution in the architectural field. One of them is actually the crisis of dimensions such as structure and tectonics. But more importantly, closer to the question of dwelling, a third crisis of the notion of space. We no longer, the kind of modernist space has lost part of its relevance and is no longer, the kind of tool that architects use as a guideline. And in some ways, in buildings such as those produced by Zaha Hadid Architect or UN Studio, the topological complexity may recall us at times on the work of space of modernist architecture, but the resemblance remains superficial, insofar as the desire effect, starting with a certain feeling of disorientation, are quite different in truth. So most of the time, actually, architectural interiority seems to unfold in relation to other factors, such as, again, textures and light, envisaged no longer as a dramatic revelation of the space, but as parameters belonging to what Rainer Banham would have called the well-tempered environment. In some ways, the modernist accent on space is behind us, and we are entering a very different mode of interiority of architecture. Mode of interiority in which, for example, parameters such as thermodynamic parameter, temperature, gradient of humidity, etc., are becoming much more influential. And an architect like Philip Ram, in projects which pay a special attention to these phenomena, temperature, humidity, etc., have epitomized. In some ways, we are gradually entering new conception of interiority, in which the traditional modernist approach in terms of architectural space is no longer completely relevant. So what does it mean to feel at home in such a context? Dwelling seems to be subjected to very complex and sometimes contradictory trends. To begin with, and this is announcing the second part of the three-tiered argument I wanted to make about dwelling, the crisis of the modernist notion of space is deeply related with a questioning of the human subject as radically distinct from what surrounds him or her. The inhabitant do not settle anymore within an emptiness that is up to him or her to furnish. He moves within a field of forces and networks, which tends to abolish any kind of clear separation between the subjective and the objective, between the subjective interiority and the exteriority of the environment. So, and this is where, by the way, the notion of affect, introduced by the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, has been often mobilized by proponents of digital architecture. So this situation seems, in a way, to reinforce the idea of that the home should be a cocoon, that's something that is inseparable, something almost like clothing that espouses the form, the body of the inhabitant, etc. Except, so on the one hand, cocooning, but except that at the same time, the home has new windows on the exterior with all the screens that characterizes it. So in some ways, if I had to summarize what I just said, on the one hand, because the subject becomes inseparable from the immediate environment of the home in which that he or she experiences, the home looks a little bit like a closed entity. On the other hand, it is open on the outside through the multiple channel of telecommunication and digital communication with the exterior. This is something that historians of science and technology had remarked already when studying digital culture at large. For example, Paul Edwards, the historian of technology, in his seminal analysis of the control room of the first large computer network, which was the anti-aerial defense network of the United States in the late 1950s, had observed that actually in these spaces, they were closed to, opaque to the exterior, but at the same time open to it through screens. One could say that this is the same that is gradually happening to the home. That, on the one hand, it's more centered upon itself, and at the same time, open to the exterior world through screens. So inhabiting in that respect is something complex and even somewhat contradictory between being closed and be open to the world. The same is true, by the way, of other aspects. The home should be closed, but at the same time allow for other kind of relation to the exterior. One of them today very clearly is a new relation to nature and natural elements. One of the reasons of the success of Bueri Bosco Verticale in Milan was actually this kind of seamless connection between the materiality of the architecture and the direct contact with planted elements, trees, various plants, etc. As if, you know, what was at stake was actually, on the one hand, protecting from the outside, but at the same time connecting with all kinds of non-human beings, beginning with vegetation. So the contrary distinction, so one could say that our relation to the physical world today is based on the blurring of the distinction between subject and object, on a kind of redefinition of what it means to be closed and open to the world, through the question of the screen, but also on a kind of radical blurring or rearticulation, rather, of the relation between humans and non-humans, and also challenging the distinction between the natural and the artificial. In a way, the home used to be within natural settings, but distinct from it. Today, there is this idea that the ideal home should be something in which we humans are also meeting with all sorts of non-human phenomena and beings. So at this stage, you know, after reviewing very quickly this kind of different experience of the material world and what does it tell us about what it means to feel at home, I'd like to move to who is the inhabitant, who inhabit these new spaces, who experiences this new materiality of the home. And this leads me to my second point, a different inhabitant. So since the Renaissance, the architectural discipline had posited a subject which was isolated in space and able, from the privileged position of the observer, to experience buildings as spectacles that could generate emotion and pleasure. This was, you know, the famous Vitruvian man of the Renaissance, and this, you know, he experienced, so to say, things almost from the exterior, you know, and this is what perspective was about. Modernism had not really challenged that. Whereas the inhabitant of the digital age seems to belong to a very different species. He or she appears not as a concentrated individuals, like a statue, the sharp contour of which contrasts with his or her surroundings, but as a looser, more diffuse or rather distributed subject, whose presence extends far beyond his or her body. Instead of being collected, compact, immobile, or in movement, but endowed with a fundamentally isolated character, this contemporary subject seems in incessant circulation under variable and changing subjective condition and social identities, moving constantly in physical or electronic networks. So moving from this very defined figure to this more complex figure in which, in some ways, where does individuality ends, where does the exterior begin, where does subjectivity and objectivity interface? All these questions are not as clear, and which means also a subject that is distributed along various networks, social network being one of them, but not the only one. So this is not a completely new phenomenon. Actually, there have been a lot of people since, by the way, interestingly, the dawn of the computer in the 1950s and 1960s, who have written to suggest that instead of thinking of the country individual as, in traditional terms, as a completely distinct from its environment, one should rather envisage it as an ecology inseparable from its surroundings. And an anthropologist like Gregory Bateson, who was also an early cybernetist, was suggesting that. And this is something that you find in the 1960s and 1970s, which is very powerful, and which has continually developed since. Which means that we're no longer individuals in the traditional sense that modernism still was actually subscribing to. We have become very different with multiple variable and mobile identities, something perhaps closer to what the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard characterized as a postmodern subject, intrinsically diverse, assuming sometimes very different, even contradictory roles. And this is also something close to Bruno Latour's, the late Bruno Latour's characterization of the human as a mediating figure in constant circulation. So this is where, of course, this subject is so different from the way we envisage what it meant to be human, that the temptation is great to think in terms of post-human. Are we becoming post-human by being partly distributed in all these networks, many of them electronic? Going even further, could we imagine actually just to be a presence in digital networks? With the rise of AI, could we actually also become inseparable from this kind of digital intelligence? This is the kind of speculation that has led to this notion of singularity, with people like Raymond Kurzweil, who has announced repeatedly the possibility to really become post-human by transcending biology. So one thing to note, however, is that, Kurzweil announced that the singularity would be in the mid-2020s. Now, this is further, we're not yet there, though you may have noticed that this discussion around the singularity has come back to the forefront with the very recent rise of AI in the public debate. So there are other ways to understand how could we be understood as different from traditional humans. After, anthropologist Donna Haraway, the cyborg, the kind of hybrid between flesh and technology has been another way to put that. But does the post-human, under all its guises, summarizes all that there is to say about what's happening to individuals in the digital world? One could say that, yes, on the one hand, we are becoming post-human. We are becoming inseparable from technology. We are perhaps on the verge of hybridizing our mind with artificial minds, though we're not yet there, to be honest. But this is among the possibilities opened by very recent technological development. On the other hand, aren't we still very human, with our hopes or expectation or fear or disillusion, and above all, or still very material and traditional spatial experience? So to illustrate that, on the one hand, this is on the left a Facebook network of somebody who actually circulates between various networks of sociability on Facebook. So yes, we are distributed. We are these kind of network-like forms of subjectivity that are no longer bounded by our body and our skin. On the other hand, the success of practices like tattoos should remind us that we're still very much these human beings who inhabit flesh, who are still living within our bodies. So how can we feel at home, both by being these distributed form of subjectivities that are constantly on the move, constantly in circulation, and at the same time those creatures who still are very physical, attached to our bodies. Whereas Sherry Turkle, insisted, the MIT sociologist, on a kind of destabilization of the self that the digital was creating. My own take is rather to say that, yes, the self is destabilized, but it's also permanently reconstructed through the use of digital tools. So, who are we? Are we post-human? Are we still humans? Are we hyper-modern, post-modern, post-human? Probably all of that at the same time. As I've tried to show on different scale, from the return of ornament in country architecture to the experience of the city, the evolution of the built environment bears the mark of these ambiguities. And I think this is probably, for me, the most fundamental question of digital technology. What does it tell us about ourselves? Who are we? Are we still humans? Are we becoming something else? By the same token, where do we want to live? What does home means for the creatures that we have become? One thing is sure, dwelling in the digital age appears as a contested field. There is no simple answer to the question I just raised. That will lead me to the last part of, I mentioned the three levels: the experience of the physical world, then the material world, then the question of, who are we in relation to these kind of different experience of the material world? And last question, where is housing going? Are we seeing evolution? And for that, we have probably to go much beyond the digital and look at what's happening more generally in terms of what are the proposals on the table to think differently of the home. So housing is a completely contradictory field. And I would say that many of these questions are on the table, but there is no definitive answer. Take, for example, the size of housing. One of the things the pandemic has made us more and more aware was that actually surface of dwelling matters, square feet matter. On the other hand, in many countries, the tendency to reduce the square footage available to inhabitants has continued, like here in Hong Kong. So as I said, it's difficult to pinpoint transformation of the habitat linked to digital technology that goes in a very clear single direction. We have rather to try to pinpoint contradiction, meaningful contradiction that tell us something not necessarily about where this is going, but about what matters. What are the questions on the table? So in the digital age, the home is invested both with a desire for stability, because we live in a constantly changing world. So we want at some point to be able to experience peace, to be able to recenter, to be able to reground ourselves. And at the same time, a growing concern for adaptability and even flexibility. And for example, UN Studio has made this proposal of a home that can be completely flexible with mobile units, etc. So, is it really a place for serenity, or is the home actually becoming an artifact as mobile as the other one? Revealingly, the workplace is also becoming more and more mobile. Another question, this is a very famous urban development in Vienna, Frauenwerkstatt, in which flexibility, families grow and then children leave past a certain point. So how to adapt to the different ages in life? Aren't traditional housing thought in two static ways? So again, we want the home to be a place of rest, to be a stable place. And we want it to be flexible, to be adaptable, to change throughout our life. So how do we do that is not such a simple question. We want also, so it's striking also how we want the home to be more technological than it used to be. and at the same time, we have this kind of bizarre nostalgia for the interior of the past. We want more sensors, and we want at the same time more nature, more traditional elements. So again, the home is, the question of dwelling is a contested place. The most fundamental contradiction today may refer to the increasingly individualistic character of country social life and the simultaneous desire to recover forms of collective life. And this is directly linked to the digital. One could say that the digital makes us even more lonely than isolated than we used to be. With the digital, you can suppress pretty much 2/3 of the social contacts, direct social contacts you had before. And at the same time, we have invested the digital with our desire to reconnect, to be social, etc., hence social networks. The home is experiencing very similar tension. On the one hand, more and more individualistic. On the other hand, we want to have all these, more adaptable things. Sorry, I forgot to show this picture. It was about flexibility. This is a project from the Bartlett, which is very much about transformable buildings and using robotics and AI. So to go back to what I was just saying, the kind of individual, but at the same time collective, this is why we have all these co-living, co-individuality programs which are developing. If there is one thing new in housing trends, is the search for alternative way of living, which are in between the individual and the collective, not necessarily the family apartment of old, but something in which people can be both alone and connected. This is also something, for example, to go back to Vienna on another project, the Wohn project in Vienna, with its participatory character and its multiple shared amenities. So this might be also the true meaning of urban agriculture. Urban agriculture is not only about meeting plants, it's about connecting with people. Now, among the other things which are very striking are, of course, with the Internet of Objects, the kind of idea that the home of the future will be more technologically driven, smart, programmable, etc. The programmable home, the smart home, appears more and more as a distinct possibility. And, you have all kinds of speculation on that. And, you can even imagine, just like we have these fantastic AI pictures, moving pictures today, that you will have programmable ambiances, that you can have even AI-driven interiors in which you'll be in conversation with a kind of spirit of the home, digital spirit of the home, etc. So yes, this is a possible evolution, but I'd like to bring some more sobering thought, because of course this may, and this is definitely going to happen in a number of situations, but let me remind you that actually we of course live in the digital age, but the material challenges have not gone. One thing is sure, for example, slums are still concerned more than 1 billion people all over the planet. And if you add to that poor quality housing, you realize that actually the smart home is not the most urgent problem. Most urgent problem is improving housing. So there, the digital can do things. For example, in slums, this is an NGO. One of the problems of slums is that people are limited in what they can do because they don't have a physical address very often. So actually, this is an NGO using digital technology and GPS to actually give an address to people living in Indian slums. So more ambitious, even, the kind of mapping, for example, of slums by MIT Sensible Lab. In the same vein of improving the material condition of, the most deprived, for example, all the perspective of 3D printing. So yes, The digital will not be only a question of smart home. It may bring a number of concrete solutions to some of the most pressing challenges. In other words, we shouldn't forget about the atoms, because we still live very much in a world of atoms. And, in the age of global warming is something that is a profound limit to what the digital can achieve. Let me finish. I've reached the very end of this lecture. I wanted to raise a final question, which is, with whom are we going to live? Historically, we've never lived only with humans. For centuries, we lived with animals, and we still today find cats, dogs, etc., birds in a number of our homes. Animals are very present in in human history, and they're still present. This is probably a more radical kind of co-living with animals. It's actually my friend Rahul Mehrotra village for people who actually live with elephants in Jaipur in India. So this is a bit extreme, but let's not forget that we shared our cities with horses, for example, for centuries, etc. Now, the big question is that, a new kind of species is emerging, and with artificial intelligence, and what does it imply for dwelling? Hollywood movies such as Her or Ex Machina have evoked these potential housemates, and by lending them a kind of ghostly presence, as if they were haunting the places occupied by humans, on the fringe that separates the material and the immaterial. But, what they raise is also, to what extent are we different from machines? One thing for me is certain. We don't know completely what it means to be human. Are we like animals, or are we more like machines, or are we a compound of both? Part of us feels comfortable with cats, dogs, horses, not to mention elephants. But another part of us speaks to computer after having worshipped all kind of mechanical apparatuses. Who are we? Again, for me, the most central question of the digital age is not the technology, and it's about who are we as human. Take AI. Of course, AI may be frightening in political terms, etc., but I think by the end, AI raises the question, what is the boundary between the human and the non-human? And dwelling in the digital age is something that confronts human to their inner complexity and lack of, we are indeterminate creatures. We can be a lot of things, sometimes things which look contradictory. And this is, to be human is actually synonymous with never being totally sure of what it means to be humans. And I'd like to conclude on that remark and stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thanks a lot, Antonio. I think it's a very profound and very deep discussion, which actually matters recent, not only in the practice, but also pedagogy education system. I think we make a huge discussion on the material and immaterial. Actually, what is the influence of the inhabitation situation of the future in architecture discipline? So I would like to firstly ask some question, and based on you actually put forward three main questions, and last one is maybe with whom are we going to live in the future, actually with the human factors and non-human factors which already exist. And parallel with this lectures, like Neil Leach, who actually put forward a lecture series on the AI, and he actually make a conversation with me 2 years ago, and we write a dialogue, material versus immaterial. So actually, I'm quite actually influenced by your book, The Materiality of Architecture. I think I quite engage in, although we're living in a digital age, but actually the daily life of human being cannot live without materiality. Actually, we're touching the materials, we meet different peoples, but actually the COVID situation influenced a lot, including the online teaching becomes more common. Actually, the whole world is connecting by this kind of Zoom teaching behaviors. But at the same time, we're looking forward to have some face-to-face, people to people. They can meet together. Like this year, we try to organize the offline workshops. I think we still remind us before 2020. It's so impressive to make a lot of progress based on the people who communicate face-to-face with each other. You can touching, including the robotics, this kind of materials in different workshops. I think that is impressive to us. We are looking forward to go back to have special opportunities. So we reduce the number of the workshops, but engage or try to organize more for this kind of physical workshops this year. So it's a kind of it's kind of a reverse style for us to resistant on the virtual behaviors, actually, which already happened in the teaching in our pedagogy. So, but at the same time, we can see the new generation, including with teaching undergraduate students over the past 3 years, they actually spend most of their time online with their professors, with their classmates. We can very easily find these generation very difficult to make physical models or with some one-to-one mock-up pavilions. I think they more like talk to each other, they like talk discussion, and they like maybe connecting each other by the mobile and by this kind of online meetings. So I think the behavior pattern actually already changed. It's hard to say it's already changed. And I think the quality of the studios actually make a lot of discussion. It's kind of, if you check their drawings or their model making skills, it cannot compete to like 3 years ago, the studio's standard. But actually they have some deeper engagement in the AI generative toolbox in the design process. They use like ChatGPT and the Stable Diffusion, this kind of new toolbox to generate a lot of images. And also the narrative presentation is totally different to the physical models, this kind of experience, this kind of phenomenon-based underlying or introduction style in the studios. I think so. So back to your come back to your question, with whom are we going to live? I think some of the human behavior pattern is inevitably changed by the environment, by maybe the COVID situation, and also this kind of behavior pattern is difficult to go back to 5 years ago. I think the world already changed. And from last year, because of ChatGPT and AIGC, which make a huge progress, and actually the generative toolbox, we also develop our own toolbox by our PhD students. I think it's quite challenging the communication ways with the client. So the architects make a lot of presentation based on their model. They spend a long time rendering, make physical drawings. But right now, AIGC can very soon, like in 1 day or 2 days, they can rendering a huge numbers of narrative with prompts, with images. Actually, this kind of behavior already changed the design working flow and the ways how to communicate with the client and with your partners. So that is the reality, actually, which is totally. So although we still try to introduce or try to educate the generation skill, go back to the materiality. We should focus on the face-to-face, human-to-human communication, but inevitably something already coming. So my question goes to Anthony Bicom. I think I want to ask you, what's your impression on this such kind of transformation? I think it's really soon, just half a year. I think AIGC and everything in AI changing so rapidly to the human behaviors. So what's your comments to such kind of transformation?
A series of things. The first is, of course, a number of things. By the way, again, what I said at the beginning, I think the crisis has accelerated transformation that had begun before. You know, we had begun to talk more and more online before the pandemic, and the pandemic accelerated the evolution. So it's a deeper thing than just etc. So I think, yes, a number of things have, but I think very often I'm thinking we ask the wrong question. The real question is not what are we going to do on Zoom, what is AI going to do, but rather what should we continue to do as humans, etc. Because of course AI can do a lot of things, but I think what is the role that we want to keep as humans in a world in which machines are going to do more and more things? By the same token, we all know that we can do a lot of things on Zoom. I saw that someone was putting a note that documents should be in Chinese. Sorry about that, but my Chinese is limited. Fortunately, DeepL enables me to translate. I think, again, of course, I'm on Zoom, I'm not in person, etc. But what is the meaning if I go to Shanghai, soon? What do we expect that will be different from what is on Zoom? So instead of constantly asking ourselves, what is going to go on Zoom, etc., rather, what is AI going to do? Rather ask ourselves, what is it we want to keep as a prerogative of the human? Because also, by the end, let's not forget that we're born and we die in the physical world, not in the virtual, whatever happens. So there is still, whatever happens, we're not going to dethrone the physical world, except if Kurzweil is right, and at a certain point we're able to upload our consciousness in machine, but we're still very far from that. Until the singularity becomes a reality, I still think that, the physical world is unavoidable. If you take, for example, the pandemic, the real problem for many students, at least in Europe, was, or in the United States, was not actually the connection. It was actually living in spaces which were too small. So I would say let's invert, and instead of fetishizing only on the technology, ask ourselves, what does the technology tell us about the way we lead our lives? You see what I mean? Because of course we can do a lot of things on Zoom. And we could actually imagine universities being completely remote. It would not be completely impossible, but why is it that we still want Tongji to be in Shanghai? We still want Harvard to be in Cambridge, sorry. So what is going on in places? And it goes back to what does it mean to inhabit? University also inhabit. So what do we expect from that? And we expect from that, and actually the truth is we expect from that it's going to be more authentic, it's going to be more human, etc. So what does it mean? You see, so I would really suggest inverting completely the question. The question is not what can we do with all these tools, because we know we can do a ton of things. Pretty much. With ChatGPT, you can do relatively good quality student paper at the end of class. Don't do it, of course, but then the question becomes, why do we want students to validate a module, and what do we expect them to learn? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
actually, you know, artificial intelligence very soon will be able to produce relatively decent design. But then why do we still want to train designers? What do we expect
Yeah.
from designers is the real question.
Yes, that's a lot of amazing questions. Actually, we should discuss. Just as you mentioned, the subjectivity and the objectivity. Actually, I think we design object for people to inhabit it, for dwelling.
Absolutely.
But right now, it seems we design not only the physical inhabited space, but also maybe connecting the interiors and also the ways how we're connecting the outside world. That should be all.
That's what I call the new window of the home.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know, as I said, you know, the home is in a bizarre situation in which we want it to be a cocoon and at the same time connected. So, but also sometimes, you know, what is very striking, sometimes, you know, you just have a meeting in a place in which there is no connection. And all of a sudden, the quality of the meeting improves. So
Great.
we will have in the future also to use intelligently disconnection.
Yeah, I think because Anton, you are a very important theorist and historical theorists and researchers. So my question goes: how would you like to address the recent situation into the history? And I think it is kind of connecting the history to the future is a very important role for the theorist. So how would you like to set up this kind of connection between the past and future? So,
well,
and it should based on the philosophy and also based on a lot of the artifacts which already existing, and maybe some special detours which can leading us very specially. That is maybe not in the main history of the past few years, but actually that's still have a very important enlightenment possibilities hidden in the history, which can produce certain kind of very important quality, very important influence to the future architecture discipline. So, would you like to have any comments on the connections between the recent transformation to the history, the past, and how to address us in such kind of situation?
Okay, I would say that we went in the past couple of decades, there was a kind of crisis of history. You know, if we go back in time, postmodernism, when it arrived, gave birth to a new interest in history. You know, the modernist has erased a little bit the historical consciousness. And when in the 1980s, which must look like the Middle Ages for most of our listeners, but there was this kind of new interest in history, rediscovering the complexity of the past, etc. And then the digital came, etc. And, you know, in some ways, things were going so fast that there was not much time for history. I think now there is, in my opinion, the need to reestablish a connection to history for at least two reasons. The first is that some of the questions that we may believe are totally new are not so new. For example, in the 18th century, the philosopher Denis Diderot asked himself repeatedly, to what extent are we like machine? To what extent do we think differently from machines? This is an Enlightenment question, which explains also why the Enlightenment was fascinated by automaton, you know, the ancestors of robots, etc. So what is human intelligence? Is it different or not from mechanical production? Is actually a pretty old question. It's not that recent. So it's useful to go back in history sometimes to realize that questions that we believe are completely new are not so new. So that's the first thing. The second reason why some kind of historical consciousness is important today, and this is why I wanted to deal with this question of dwelling and not talk about, I have a couple of things I've developed on AI recently, but I wanted to talk about something slightly different. The reason being that, again, the question of why, the question of values, the question of meaning is becoming central. I would say that the biggest question these days in design school is not to what extent is AI going to replace the architect. I think it's actually not that important a question. I think the real important question is, why does design matter? Mm-hmm. In a period of, huge crisis of humanity, in a period of like global warming, is in some ways much more a problem than AI. If we're going to run very quickly into serious trouble. So what do we expect from design? Why does design matter? Is design a solution? Is design about the meaningfulness of life? Many people have the impression that their lives are meaningless. So a question of why, a question of values, etc. And this is why I think the humanities and history matter as a way to raise those questions. So first, realize that not everything is as new as you might think, which doesn't mean that, everything already happened, far from it, but at least understand that, questions sometimes have roots. And second, again, what is the meaning of things? And for me, that's the central question these days. The central question is, why do we still study design? Why do we have design school? Take AI. Again, the question is not so much, of course, AI is going to progress. It might be a bit slower than what Neil and others think, but that's another question. Let's just assume that it's anyway going to happen. But then, why? What would be the meaning of having a design school? And I think that's the central question.
Exactly. I think it's also a super difficult question for all the educators right now. It's a huge challenge. But I agree. I think it's an ethical question, not an academic architecture discipline question. So I think actually, during such kind of crisis, not only the climate change, but also like the COVID, and also influence the economics, have different crises coming. So how to reorientate the architecture, also orientate the digital in architecture to be a new engine or new understanding or new perspective. So if that's a special channel, we should focus to solving all kinds of questions. So we have a lot of questions, but I think it's quite amazing for today's I think it's the detour, the narrative ways you put forward and the questions and analyze the situation of the inhabitants of the architects and also all the professors. We have some questions coming from
so there is one from Stella Shen. Stella, so hi, Professor. In the near future, everyone, including, could possibly become cyborgs. What issues of opportunities do we see? Hello, Stella. You can talk directly if you want. You can unmute yourself.
Please.
Hey, Professor Picon, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I'm like really interested in what you've just presented. I think it's very inspiring, first of all, and thank you for those questions that really deserve us like to give deeper thoughts. But also because like I'm working on projects that discusses like the new relationship between humans and nature in our current like in our time, and it seems like it's possible that we can just like embed artificial intelligence into everything nowadays, even like into human brains. And I'm just wondering what kind of new relationship is going to be created, given we probably are facing such a future. And do you see it's more kind of an issue or it's more kind of an opportunity for us as human beings? Like,
I think both. I'm working right now, I'm preparing a book on cities, nature, and technology. I would say two things. one is we are conflicted on this issue. On the one hand, we live more and more in a techno nature. That's to say, a nature that is in continuity, which is seamlessly linked to our technology. So yes, we can transform everything into cyborg. On the other hand, do we really want that our cat becomes a cyborg? Aren't we expecting from the non-human to remain non-human? And not necessarily. So I think it's there again, a question of values, a question of meaning. Do we still want something to remain purely non-human? Or do we want it to be tainted with our technology? Because by the end, AI is still our technology. So, what do we want with the non-human world? And I think, we're conflicted. It's a little bit, to give another example. On the one hand, we want nature to remain nature. On the other hand, we want it to become an infrastructure in our cities. So there is something there which is deeply contradictory. I think we need, in some ways, to know what is it we want. I think the biggest question today, and for me, it's also the biggest question with AI, we don't know what we want. And we'd rather figure that out quickly if we want to use AI properly. The biggest question is not what AI wants. Biggest question, what do we want from AI? So, right. So it is full of opportunities, but is that what we want? Is a good question.
Mm-hmm. So just to follow up, sorry, I feel like I'm taking too much of the time here, but like just to follow up, yeah. But do you think is it even possible for all of us human beings to reach an agreement on those questions? If not, then there will be, different opinions, right? But then, a lot of times, we are forced to, to develop, we're forced to advance, in technology or in, I don't know, just in technology in general. Then does that mean that we're going to just live with this contradiction forever? Or I don't know,
well, yeah. take questions. Yes, we may have to live with some of these contradictions for a while. Take abortion right. You may have seen that in the US, it's a heated debate. And speaking there again, abortion right revolves around what it does mean to be human, at what stage is, a pack of cells becoming human, etc. So even without talking about, plants, animals, etc., even, a pack of human cells rapidly developing, we don't know yet. So yes, we might be living. On the other hand, I would say that we still, fortunately, as mankind, still subscribe to a number of universal values. So who will win? The kind of universality of certain values, or, a fragmented. I think one of the biggest questions from the US to China and from China to Europe is, are we inexorably drifting toward a more and more divided mankind? Or are we going to be able to reinvent some collective values at the scale of the planet? So honestly, I don't know. I'm like you, I'm perplexed, but I think it's a big question.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great opportunity to be able to communicate and chat with you.
Thank you. Just a second, because the next one.
Qi Jiaqi, would you like to ask a question?
Hear you because I changed. No, just. Can you hear me still?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay, sorry, my earphone were dying. So there was another question. Would you think AI improve the fairness as information is easier to access, of unfairness? Honestly, I'm a bit pessimistic so far. When you look what has happened with social networks, I think we're going to be in troubled water for a while. You take information control, you take fake news, you take etc. Look what happened to Twitter. I'm not super optimistic so far. what I'm still trying to be is optimistic on the long run. That's to say, to give an analogy, when the radio emerged, the radio became quickly one of the privileged means of fascist regime to enroll people. You know, the Nazi in Germany, the fascist in Italy, in another genre, the communist, the Soviet communists used the radio. So every regime wanted to use the radio. The American government did. So we may see something like that, plus a number of distasteful people. So I'm not sure fairness is going to be the main characteristic of AI for a while. What I'm hoping is that at some point it will become a bit more regulated. Mm-hmm. But I'm not over optimistic in the near future.
Yes, great. So we have our professor, young professor Jiang Jiawei. Would you like to directly ask question to Professor Picon? Jiang Jiawei, are you here?
Mm-hmm.
Jiawei. Yes, his question. Thanks, Professor, for the lecture.
He's coming. He's coming.
Thank you.
Please.
So yeah, thanks, Professor Picon and Professor Yuan. And my question is quite simple. Because Professor Picon is an architecture historian, so I want to ask the question mainly about how the AI technology would do effect to the historians. So ChatGPT, I find that is extremely kind of full of errors if we ask him or ask this machine some in-depth historical questions because it's a relatively narrow domain. So do you think it's possible, or in which way can we train and build a kind of self-customized AI, the ChatGPT, for a historian? And if we do it in this way, how can we help the historian to build up like a database or other kind of technology to help them do their own job? Or how do you look at these problems right now?
Well, two things. The first, if you take Wikipedia, every historian is using Wikipedia, even if he or she will not confess it. And Wikipedia is full of mistakes. But what historians know is how to check things. So when you really have to write something, usually you try to check even what you read on Wikipedia. So and then, you know, what historians do is hierarchize sources and text. You know, what you read in a journal doesn't have the same status as what you read in an academic journal, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, yes, we could, you know, I think AI will probably improve in terms of accuracy. There will be less mistakes, and probably it has to do with the training. I think, you know, how you train AI, what basis, you know, right now, most of these AI things function using the web at large, and the web is full of crap. There are a lot of fantastic things and a lot of erroneous things. So you need probably to train AI in a more, you know, restricting it to text, which are, you know, a bit better, have a better academic status, which is not what is yet happening. So that will be the beginning of the solution. Then probably imagine that AI will have to be trained with historians more generally, and, you know, correcting the AI may be part of the process. So yes, we will have AI. You know, we may also want just, you know, an AI to ingest all that we've ever written. And then, you know, if I need to write another piece on 18th century engineering, I can just delegate it to the AI, who can use my own text. So there are a lot of ways in which we can use AI as historians. But yes, it will improve. That I'm not worried about. I'm still worried a little bit about, speaking of the Anthropocene, you know, the kind of energy cost, CO2 emission cost of AI, which isn't yet not a very easy question to solve.
Okay,
then
thank you.
Alice, sorry, Jiawei, did I answer your question or?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Then I have a question which I don't understand, which is Alice, have a good web to see. What do you mean?
Maybe we can skip this question and goes to have two more
Okay.
questions.
Okay, the crisis has revealed something. Is the anonymous attendee here or not? Been done before in the way, okay, it is reality, it's psychological, spiritual. Is how to blur the boundaries and at the same time to achieve reality, psychology. I'm not sure I completely understand. That's more a statement, which is quite interesting. Boundaries of numbers. Yes, I do think that, I would agree that the real question is, which is a little bit what Akim Menges and others have tried, and, Philippe, etc. How do we live in a digitally augmented physical world? And I agree that's part of it. How also do we, redefine reality given or change in psychology, etc. So there is this feeling and specific nature of depth is. Okay, let me precise because I see the reference to the theater, what I mean by a theater. I don't think the task of I think that what architecture does, I use the theater as an example. If the theater is empty, and you come with a few friends, and one of you get on the stage, whatever he or she will say acquires a kind of special resonance because she's standing on the stage, okay? What architecture does is to frame human action to suggest that they have a special relevance. It doesn't tell you what is the plot, doesn't tell you what is the play that should be performed. It just tells you that whatever you do has a relevance. So that's just like a theater, a theater doesn't write plays. It enables plays to be performed, and it suggests strongly that plays are meaningful. So that's what architecture does. So, of course, it nudges in certain direction. There are theater which are more conducive to drama, others to comedy, etc., etc. But that's a little bit, what I mean by architecture is like a theater. Doesn't tell you what the human action is going to be. It tells you that there is an action and it does matter. I saw that Liu Hui has a question. Liu?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, can you just speak a bit louder if you don't mind?
Okay, thank you. And it's great to hear your conversation here. And these days, I heard an opinion that creative is equals to experience plus logic and intuition. And I think experience and the logical is 2% that AI what is good at, but the intuition is our human beings can do better. And maybe the education of architecture to find the logic in experience, but the more important is to teach us about the intuitions in the design. What do you think about it?
I think it's an interesting point. I'm not sure completely that you could imagine that AI may become creative easily. After all, Neil Leach raises this question very often, what is creativity, etc. I think for me, okay, let me try to put it simply. I think what we still have as an advantage on the machine are two things which are actually related. The first is that as humans, we know better than machines what matters to us as humans. Mm-hmm. Okay, still following me, Liu?
Yes.
So, which is for me, what matters is linked to another question which is called the meaning. meaningfulness, which is also strangely for me linked to the fact that we have a body. And meaning is not only something that floats in the air. Meaning is never only about an idea. Meaning is about the intersection, the interaction between the fact that we are physical beings and that we can share concept, etc. So I would say the two advantages we have so far, but for how long is another question, is that we have bodies and that we know what matters to us better than machines. So for me, and inhabiting for me, a machine doesn't inhabit because it doesn't have a body. A machine, an artificial intelligence so far. So it may change in the future. So I'm not saying that forever, but so far, we are the only one with animals, etc., with creatures with a body that do inhabit. Cats, for example, tend to inhabit. Whoever has a cat knows that. Dogs also, etc., horses, humans inhabit. That's one of the things that, human beings in that respect are different from machines. So my argument being that one of the fundamental characteristics of architecture is about inhabiting. It's designing in order for people to inhabit. So that would be what is for me unique. Not necessarily creativity, but something different, which means that, the machine could actually produce the solution, but we would be the one to judge whether the solution is something that we consider as the right solution.
Yes, I think Professor Picon gave the most important comments from this question, actually, which putting forward a difference between the subjectivity is human central based or augmented human based or something non-human based. I think it should be put on the table to make further discussion. I think that's the difference between Picon's lecture and what Neil Leach actually these days put forward. So what's the meaning of AI can produce should base on maybe the human perspective, the human motivation, and the question we raised. And I think that the meaning is only a human being can put forward or can raise such kind of question. So I think it's a great comment, and also that is the representative materiality of architecture in that book. Picon actually make a lot of argument and make a lot of discussions, and also some different facts he raised to prove still the human existing situation, the experience of human being, the experience in different habitation is so important to us. So although the technology make huge progress, but still we should remember and should try to figure out how we should exist in such kind of situation. So it's great lecture Professor gave us today. So any question? We have also some senior professor here. I don't know, Professor Lu Yongyi would like to ask any questions. Okay, Yan Chao, if you are here, welcome.
Yes. Hi, Professor Picon. I have one question. Well, I always see it as a great opportunity to think about AI, because by understanding AI, we can somehow better understanding ourselves. And I fully agree that by far our advantage is to have a physical body to embody it in the physical world. So thinking about how to give a body to AI in the near future, there could be two possibilities. One is give him or her a real physical body, maybe a machine or a robot. Another possibility is to coding them somehow to let them know or to let them think they have a body. but without a physical body. So do you think there could be a major difference between these two scenarios? I think that's quite important, because if we can understand that scenario, we better be understanding how our body works in order to create our own kind of consciousness or perception or imagination.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I would still think that, the second case, you would do to AI what, the machine did to the humans in the Matrix.
Yeah.
Which would be to make the AI live in a fiction,
Yes.
etc. I do believe that, yes, you could, but then I'm not sure. If you go back to the Matrix, you may remember that by the very fact that it's a fiction, actually, you can do a lot of things that you cannot do in the real world. So I would say the second aspect, I would still favor rather the first solution, which is to give a kind of real body, because only a real body will also impart you with the limits of the physical. It depends what you're expecting the AI to do. If you want the AI to deeply understand what is architecture about, then AI must understand what are the constraints that are implied by living in a world of atoms.
Yeah.
And if you remember the Matrix, once they understand, once you're in the Matrix, you can pretty much do a lot of things which are impossible in reality. You can jump from skyscraper and not get harmed, etc., which is not very conducive to good architecture. Good architecture starts when actually you are not able to jump from the Empire State buildings and be unharmed, because good architecture is linked to really understanding strength, but also weaknesses, and more generally, what is the human condition? Architecture is designed for the humans. So, if you want AI to really understand what is meaningful to humans, you must probably give it an experience that is relatively similar to humans. Another possibility, though, would be, and this one you may not have thought about, but it wouldn't be necessarily a design AI, but AI giving it as a body a building. Which is a little bit what Cedric Price generator project was about.
Yeah.
So, which is in some ways giving AI a different body. And the AI will not be able to necessarily design architecture, but it can manage complex system and, giving the complex system as a body to the AI.
Yeah, that's very good point. Yeah. I need to think about it.
Good. I think we have the last but not least question. I would like to go to Liu Ran. Would you like to ask a question by yourself? Liu Ran?
Oh, sorry. Hello, and thank you for the lecture. Following it, I'm under the impression that the ambiguity of the human experience is ever growing. So accordingly, would the continuous growth of the paradoxical relationship with dwelling produce a sort of sense of instability of the self and of the meaning that is related to being oneself, or reinforce its underlying nature of this perpetual duality, requiring the need to interiorize and exteriorize through the different relationships with space?
Very good question. I'm not sure that the ambiguity of the human experience is actually growing. I'm not sure. I don't know, honestly, because, when you were a believer in God in medieval Europe, part of yourself was an eternal soul. Another part of yourself had a body like an animal. So it was a pretty complex relationship. So is it growing or is it not? I'm not sure, honestly. I do believe that we are indeed, and that's what you're saying, in a period of instability, because we are in a period of transition. And this is where the technology has produced instability, or fostered instability rather. And I would, but I would fully agree with your last thing. I think we need constantly to interiorize and exteriorize. This is what it means to be human, actually. We're interiorizing something. And, you know, if you think a little bit about technology, we constantly do that with technology. You know, a lot of anthropologists have written that technology is about exteriorizing with tools, but then you interiorize the way to use tools. So we're constantly doing both. So overall, I would agree with your statement, though I would probably add a pinch of, you know, not completely sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You are muted, Philip.
I think a very interesting question. Also, Professor Picon gave a very, very fantastic, impressive answer. So I think it's almost 2 hours. I would like to show great thanks to Professor Picon coming tonight to give this lecture to the PhD student. I think thanks for Professor Picon, and also congrats to him because he was elected as a Digital Future Fellow, and in the fellow group of professors. I think we have 7 right now, and we will formally announce 2 days later for this good news. And I would like to show great thanks to Professor Picon, contributes his time and also contributes his thinkings and his theory to the community of Digital Futures. I'm looking forward to have future opportunities, invite Professor Picon coming to Shanghai and teaching offline to our students. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Again. So thank you all the students for coming, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Philippe. Thank you all for your attention, and bye. See you in
Bye-bye.
Shanghai, hopefully not so long.
Yeah, in the near future. See you.
Thank you. Bye.